What's the connection between bias and shame? I'm Annie Gibbons. Women's Biz Leaders starts now. Women's Biz Leaders, presented by Women's Biz Global, where each episode we dive into the journeys and successes of remarkable women in business. In this episode, we delve into the intricacies of bias, exploring both its challenges and potential solutions. And joining me now is Bron Williams, a distinguished author and esteemed keynote speaker. Welcome to the program, Bronwyn.
Thanks, Annie. It's great to be here.
It's wonderful to have you on the show, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation about bias because it's one of those areas that we all know we have. We don't ever talk about it, and so I'd love you to share with us now, how does bias and shame intersect and influence us in so many areas of our life?
That's a wonderful, wonderful question. What I have observed as I've done work in presentations and workshops around unconscious bias is that I had observed that there would be somebody always who would push back and say, oh, I'm not sexist, I'm not racist, whatever the issue was. And I started to reflect on, well, why do people get defensive around looking at their biases? And I realised that most of us get defensive because a sore point has been touched. And it's generally this sense of shame, oh, that maybe that's right about me, but I don't want it to be right about me. And so we feel shame around the possibility that we could have a bias that does not sit with our values.
So how do all these, the hidden nature, I suppose, of bias, how does this then affect our workplace environments? When we go to work and we show up with these biases, we don't want to talk about them, it's got to have a huge impact.
It does have a huge impact, and it impacts every area of the workforce, from hiring and retention through work practices, work assignments, even sort of people exiting the company. And what it does is that it, in a sense, bias categorises people into groups, and we do it quite unconsciously. These are the people I trust, these are the people I'm going to dismiss. These people are like me, therefore, okay, they're my group. And, things like gossip, because what gossip does is it isolates people. Takes a little tiny bit of truth, blows it out of proportion, but the whole idea behind bias is to isolate. And that's what bias does, is it says that person, that idea, that group, they don't belong with us. And I'll isolate that person, I'll say a few things about them.
Oh, nasty and intriguing. Now, you also have a phrase, talk about superheroes in disguise. What does that mean in the context of bias and shame?
Yeah. One of the things that I discovered for myself in my own journey as a woman and a woman as a leader is that I had grown up, like many women, with the narrative of sit down, be quiet, play small.
Yes.
And it has literally taken me decades to, first of all, identify that was a reigning narrative in my life, but also then to realise that I didn't have to live out of that narrative anymore. And I wanted to, as a keynote speaker, talk to women and reassure them, remind them of their power. I had an amazing random dinner conversation and with somebody I had never met before, and one question he said to me was, who are you giving your power away to?
Oh, good question.
It's a great question, and I immediately recognised that I give my power away to men because that's what I'd been taught to do. So as women start to tap into their own power, they must recognise that they also have biases. We face bias, we face gender bias, we face sexist bias, we face ageist bias, but we have to recognise that we've got stories and narratives that have shaped biases in us, like, oh, I'm too old to be doing that, I'm too young to be doing that, I'm too fill in the blanks.
Exactly, and I get that every week with coaching people of, well, am I too old? Am I too fat, too thin, too something or other? It's absolutely incredible. So how do these biases shape our perceptions, the decision making that we do, the behaviours that we have on a daily basis? It can alter absolutely every part of your future, right?
It does, and the thing is, it's quite insidious because it's it's unconscious. But I think the first step is awareness. Just be aware that you could possibly have some biases. That's a start. Daniel Kahneman wrote an amazing book called Thinking, Fast and Slow, where he saw that human beings think in what he called two systems. System one was the fast thinking, and that's where we make snap judgments about people. And then system two was the slow thinking, where you take a step back, you're reflective, you respond rather than react. Now, biases sit in that first system. And our biases formed when we're children, from the stories that we're told by our parents, you know, the input from the media, from schools, our sporting club, all around who to trust, who to dismiss, who to respect, what's safe, what's not. And a lot of our biases form out of purely like good intentions to keep us safe. However, it's when, say, I've had a bad example or a bad situation with somebody, say somebody of a different race, and then when I meet someone of that same race in the workplace, I assume, I make an assumption, I have an expectation that they will treat me the way this other person did. So that's our bias, our prejudice. They're the way we can be treating someone totally unfairly because they remind us of somebody else.
Absolutely. I mean, I've even met people who don't like someone because of someone they didn't like had that same name. It's amazing how crazy things just get put into our brains and really, lay their tracks to distort our perspective moving forward. So what strategies can you share with our viewers today that they could, first of all, become aware of those biases and then really start responding to them? So it's awareness, recognising the variety of them and how they're impacting them.
I'll tell you a little story. I first became aware of my own biases. I didn't even know what that word meant, apart from sewing, you know, where you cut cloth on the bias. I was part of the Salvation Army team that went to Nauru when the offshore processing for asylum seekers reopened, and it was as a white Australian who'd grown up in largely white Australia. Everybody looked like me, thought like me, sounded like me, and here I was in a Pacific Island culture working with people from a variety of different nationalities. And the first thing that I noticed was my body. Stomachs churning, shoulders were tension. And it took me a while, but I realised that my body was actually telling me I was afraid. And I'm thinking, well, why am I afraid? You know, the asylum seekers were in a camp, there were fences, security guards, and I thought around what has happened in my life that makes me feel afraid, not just in an unusual or uncomfortable situation, but in this situation. And I thought back over my life, like I would have said I didn't have a racist bone in my body, but I started to reflect on the different stories that I'd been told as a child about if you were different to me, then you were wrong. And I realised that I'd learnt that difference was a threat. And then I thought, all of these people, whether they were the Nauruans or whether they were the asylum seekers from, Afghanistan and Pakistan and Iran and Iraq, they were so different to me. And so I was making an assumption that these people were a threat. So the process that I use now and that I teach is, first of all, listen to your body. What are the cues? They can be physical, like, the churning stomach, or they can be emotional, feeling uncertain, frustrated, maybe even angry. So look for the cues. Second, ask some questions. Questions are key. What's going on? What has just happened? Why is this different to what I normally experience? Then third, look at the narratives. What are the narratives that from your own life that have shaped your thinking? And then you can identify what the bias might be. For me, it was identifying my own racist bias and white privilege, but it could be identifying a sexist bias, could be identifying an ageist bias.
Sure.
It's not limited just to one side of bias.
Thank you so much for those tips and for your personal sharing. It really helps me connect with it, and I'm sure our viewers as well. what research and education is going into this space, because it's absolutely huge, and it's modelling society the way it is, and it has the potential to actually change the way we operate moving forward in a more mature, inclusive way.
Yeah, and I love that idea of maturity, because we are evolving. You know, as a child, I wouldn't have talked about these sorts of things, didn't even know what the words were. So I'm currently undertaking PhD research into the intersection of bias and shame, because there's been a lot of contemporary literature around bias, and there's a lot around shame, and there's some ancient literature, which is some of what I'll be looking at, the works of Augustine of Hippo, who's an ancient philosopher from the 4th century, and looking at what's happening with the contemporary literature around bias, what's happening around the literature around shame. And I've uncovered 2 writers already, Jessica Nordell in her book The End of Bias, where she talks about the term white fragility, where white people get, very defensive around anything to do with racism. And she says actually white fragility is an immature response to shame, the horror of actually thinking I'm racist. And then the other was an African-American theologian, Willie James Jennings, in his book Christian Imagination, Theology and the Origins of Race. Fascinating book. But he talks about the shame that is concealed inside the concept of whiteness. And here were 2 writers, 2 very different writers, who could see this link that I'd observed, and I'm thinking, okay, let's see if we can delve deeper.
Oh, I can't wait to see what comes out of your PhD research, and congratulations to you for being able to do that. I'll finish with one very quick final question then. Is this shame different from different cultures? We have this as white Australians, but do people from all cultures have that same shame link, or is it unique to Australians?
No, I don't believe it's unique to Australians. Bias is a human issue. Every human being on the planet has biases. It's just part of how we think. And I believe, given that shame is an emotion, generally we see it as an emotion, that everybody feels shame as well. So I believe this is a human issue. We can look at this from a global perspective as well. So yeah, it's about being human and understanding ourselves better.
Yeah, and it's about just being open and having a pause and reflect about all aspects of our life and how we operate the way we do. And I suppose moving forward, it's even for me today, to go out into the world and think, when I go to respond to something, I think about it, I go, is it because of a predisformed bias in a certain area, or is it an area, and I've actually really considered my own thoughts. I think we can chat all day about that. Yes. But I hope you, our listeners, our viewers, have really enjoyed this session. I think it's a really great topic because it affects all areas of our leadership, and that's what Women's Biz Leaders is all about, actually looking at different aspects from all of our guests week after week to actually find out how certain areas affect the success we have in our businesses and the way we go about life. So thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you very much for joining us.
You're watching Ticker. We'll have more in just a few minutes.